Hello,
Good.
everyone. One day we'll get it right. One day we will get the intro right. Welcome, another episode, You Talk Show. Today we are asking the question, what is and could be Australian culture? Of course,
Australian culture is having interminable and insufferable questions with way overly open-end answers so we can lead you to think like we do.
I mean, you just described my entire thought pattern on how to craft these questions. Just but in the worst possible terms.
Australian culture is dragging Kyle mercilessly. Okay, so I would like to add a third question into the mix quickly. And we tried this last time, and it ended up with a diversion into pancake breakfast that benefited no one. But we will tell you about pancake breakfast in what Australian culture could be.
Yes.
The third bit is, what have we been told that Australian culture is? Because what we've been told about Australian culture isn't necessarily the same as what Australian culture is. I feel like people around our age, early, oh god, yeah, I keep forgetting that the generation marker has just,
yeah.
A lot of you will have been sold the ideas of mateship and fairness and equality and opportunity as the ideals of Australian culture. To quote Redgum, you wouldn't let your mates down, not until they had you dusted off. Although that's a little darker than the context in which we teach these values to primary schoolers. The reality of the situation is that Australians haven't always been able to live up to those ideals. And if we look at the state of Australian culture, perhaps it is a little less about equality and opportunity and a little more about mining magnates filling their pockets. But, I think those ideals are worth fighting for. And that's sort of why I wanted to start with what have we been told? Because, we have people come to Australia for a better life, fleeing persecution, fleeing oppression. And what they know is that Australia is the land of milk and honey, where, you get a fair go, you get a fair shake of the sauce bottle, you're treated with respect and dignity. And that if you're willing to work, you can have what you desire. Oh god, I'm really about to start sounding like bloody Barilaro again.
So maybe I'll cut in here then.
No. I just want to point this out. Like those people who've come to Australia, that's part of what our reputation is worldwide. That we are the land of the fair go. And I think that it's an ideal worth preserving, and I think that with a little elbow grease, it's an ideal that we could very much realize again. Now,
see that's a very lovely
upswell. I want some trumpet music for that, Kyle. Edit in some trumpet music.
Stop creating work for me. Okay, we tried to record this episode once already, and there were so many things that created more work for me that that was only a third of the reason why we just decided to record it again, but it was a big third.
Okay, cool. So how about you tell us what Australian culture is?
Okay, well, here's the thing. So first, I actually want to make a sort of supplementary point to what you were just saying, because that's kind of how we're viewed internationally. You're kind of absolutely right. You're absolutely right, but there's also a little bit more, because I've heard several things throughout my life.
I should hope so. Last I heard, you did have ears.
Yes, but see, so said this last time as well, but there's sort of three examples actually, not just the two that I provided before. So first was I remember Mom telling me a story. This was when I was fairly young. The whole, I think, Afghanistan or Iraq war, one of them had only really just gotten underway, and it was like a year in, I think. And Marlon was telling me the story about how some civilians asked, "Are you Australian soldiers or American soldiers?" And then when we told them that we were Australian, apparently they said, "Be careful, there are snipers up ahead." And I mean, that says a lot about Australian culture, that and how we're viewed internationally, that they would be, so kind as to do that. I mean, there's I'm sure everyone can imagine just how difficult mentioning something like that could be in that position. There's a lot of things that could go wrong for everyone involved there. But they did it. They were brave enough to do that because essentially of Australia's international reputation at the time. How they viewed us
as the people who try to do the right thing.
Yeah, yeah. And the second was I was a little bit older. Sometime I think it was around 16, 17, maybe 18. And I was listening to a podcast where the people were talking about Australia, and they said that they described Australia, or they said what Australia looks like is a country that has a lot of cute furry animals and just pollutes a lot.
In fairness,
And
some of those cute furry
me,
animals, those koalas did have about as much brain as our then Prime Minister.
That is true. But yeah, I think it was about the same time the emissions trading scheme was repealed. And part of me kind of died inside because I'm just like, that's how they view us. But then later on, this was only maybe a year ago now, in a video that I was watching online, I actually heard somebody say that many people view Australia as kind of like a better America. And that, I mean, part of me is like, that's kind of nice that they view us as better, but it's also kind of shitty that they view us as being like them. Because, and it kind of, I was after that grappling with the fact that we are emulating American culture just as we have tried to emulate other cultures in the past. Recently, I was at a Scottish festival in the Southern Highlands. And it occurred to me that Australian culture, we have some really good fundamentals there. We have some really good cultural ideas and values. However, I don't think there's enough that makes it fully distinct to call it its own distinct culture. I'd refer to it more as a proto-culture. And I think in that regard, what we need is a mechanism to help organically grow and develop Australian culture on a much more local level.
Okay, and that mechanism, I'm just going to point out, is called coffee. Like this is I'm gonna cut you off there because
I
there
have
are
actually also heard
here that are important.
Yeah, I have actually also heard from other people from other parts of the world just how amazing our coffee is, which kind of makes me sad that I hate coffee because apparently it's amazing and yet I can't seem to stomach it.
Okay, so yeah, I was just going to point out, Kyle brought this up last take of, what about multiculturalism? Because he thought that multiculturalism was where I was going instead of, no, what do the folk songs tell you we are? And like anyone who has been able to grab a good cup of coffee on their way into work because they wake up at 5 a.m. Benefits from multiculturalism, from an influx of Greek and Italian migrants in the 1950s. Later in the 70s and 80s, we had immigrants from Vietnam. And that's the reason there are still so many tiny Asian bakeries where nobody speaks English, because we had Vietnamese people, many of whom were trained by the French,
Actually,
coming over,
speaking
plying their trade and providing like good quality food and setting up those small businesses.
Speaking of which, a little thing on that, there's a bakery near me, and my partner goes there, and it's a Vietnamese bakery. Does, if I remember correctly, really great pork rolls, and at the same time they still use that method that was developed in Vietnam where they have like rice flour, like ground up rice, and they mix it in with regular wheat flour and make a bread out of that.
Huh.
And it is apparently amazing. I think I might have tried it once, but I actually forget whether I did. But I
Next
hear that
time
it's
I'm in the
amazing.
inner west. Next time
Yeah,
I'm in the inner
let's go
west,
there.
take me to this place.
I'll ask my partner and we'll go there. It'll yeah.
But yeah, we have. Here's the thing: we have imported so much because, like, Australia, the modern country of Australia is 122 years old. That's not a long time. Australia post colonization has only had about 250 years. It's about the same time period as the US. And I will point that the US has, in many respects, created part of their culture by, in a very similar way, building on existing cultures.
Sure. I mean, pizza's a huge thing in the US, and well, it came from Italy.
Yeah, and if you gave an Italian person a slice of New York or Chicago pizza, their soul would shrivel up and die, and you would see their brain eject from the rear of their skull as they curled up into a ball and cried at this abomination. Okay, I'm done shitting on US pizza.
You know what? You know what's funny? It's like it kind of I get a similar feeling about the US with various different things, and I think I've come up with a perfect slogan for the US: the USA, where we do everything you do but shittier.
Except here is the thing. I would argue that what they do is everything you do but mass producible.
Yeah, sure.
Like that there is a place for that. I'm not just going to shit on our comrades in the US because quite frankly, we owe them for transistors.
Sure.
But like developing a culture is not something where it's like a computer game where if you just chuck enough resources at it and click the mouse button fast enough, suddenly you have development of like a spacefaring civilization with light speed communications. That's not how this works.
You're making me jealous of a culture in a video game that doesn't exist.
But like what? Yeah, like we have benefited a lot from importing things. I don't like the idea that we are a better America because, quite frankly, the US also doesn't necessarily have its own cohesive cultural identity, even at the smaller level, at the level of states.
If I could cut in here, because there is actually
identity. Yeah.
I actually just remembered there was a What If Altist. That's the YouTube channel, and the guy that runs it, he did a video where he was talking about the 9 American nations. And essentially what it is like there's like the islands, the Caribbean. This is like the 9 North American nations, just to be clear. It's not like the US specifically, but North America. So there's the islands, which sort of begins at the tip of Florida, then there's Cuba and all those islands. Then there's Dixie, which is basically the American South. Think where where
Mississippi,
the
Texas,
was.
That sort of area, yeah.
No, actually, well, Texas is yes, but Mississippi depends on. I don't know exactly where Mississippi is, but I know the Mississippi River runs throughout the plains, but the plains are actually another one. So I don't know if Mississippi would be in the plains or in Dixie. But essentially, then there's the plains area where there's tons of farming and everything. Then there is the empty quarter, which is like the mountainous Badlands area to the west.
Okay, so that's like Colorado.
Kind of. But then there's like the West Coast, which is kind of its own land. I forget what it's called, but it's kind of got its own like kind of amalgamation of the other parts of US culture. Then there is the industrial heartland of the US. Used to be Detroit and like the surrounding
Michigan.
couple of states, Michigan, but also a couple of other surrounding states. And then there's like the Northeast, which was like New England, the think Vermont, New York. And so, and there were more than that, I think. There are a couple more, but I forget what they
I'm
were.
not seeing what this has to do with things.
There was a reason why I brought this up, because you were talking about like
Cohesive
if there
cultural
was
identities.
yeah, so they actually have like in throughout the North American continent, they have like eight distinct cultures, and then one kind of amalgamated culture in sort of the West around California and Oregon and that sort of thing. Or at least I think it was Oregon, if I remember correctly. Which is kind of interesting. And I brought it up because it was interesting, but I didn't really think beyond that. It's interesting. Hey, look, we're supposed to be talking about interesting things. Okay, fine. Judge me all you want. You know I'm right, though. He really hates me right now.
You keep telling me to stop giving you work to do, and I know that you're going to have to edit that out because it goes nowhere.
I will not edit it out.
Oh, fuck. Okay.
It's interesting. Anyway, but I think let's relate that back to Australia, because we
What
actually
can
have
Australian culture look like? Is like this is
well, I actually think Australian culture could end up taking a similar approach, because we have like in the sense that we'll have like large regional areas which will become sort of their own distinct cultures, but this might be like 100 years down the line. But I think we've got the makings of it now, because Western Australia, particularly Perth, is pretty isolated from the rest of Australia. And they actually have like a proto-cultural element that represents that. In part, there's like it's almost kind of a joke, but also kind of half not a joke, the whole idea of secession from the Australian Commonwealth. It's mostly not a serious thing, but it's kind of like an independent streak in a way, in a kind of way that like you might say Texas or California has that, but not as crazy. Then there's you've got the region of the Murray-Darling, which is very similar to the Plains states in the U.S. So that can actually have its own very distinct culture, and kind of already does in a way, because it's people out there are why don't you describe them? You know them better than I do, but they have a certain quality that I can't find the words to describe.
it's weird because in a way the folks on the Murray-Darling exemplify a lot of what you hear in the folklore of Australians. If you've ever read The Man from Snowy River, for instance, you sort of get you read enough Australian pop culture from like the early days, and you have the image of the laconic stockman,
Laconic?
and of
I don't know that word.
then Google it. Then
Put it up on the screen.
Then you get the idea of the person who works hard during the day, who's this sort of salt of the earth type, who would give someone less fortunate the clothes off their back, who takes pride in being able to provide for their family, who is a pillar of the community, someone who the community can turn to in a time of crisis. And I think that I would say perhaps because of a lack of development of the area, economically speaking, because the Murray-Darling is still basically largely farm area, and because the Murray-Darling is an area where, I'm sorry, latte drinking inner city types, some people have real problems. it cultivates that sort of ruggedness of character and this idea of honesty and genuineness that is part of the Australian mythos.
Hmm.
That isn't something that you see in other parts of the country to the same degree.
Yeah, and I'd say they also, from what I've seen of them, whenever I've talked to somebody who's from the country, from the Murray-Darling, they've had this sort of a very sort of chill, but like a stoic, very reliable feel to them. Like I've always gotten that feeling that they are, they're just stoic and reliable in a very admirable way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So more of the Murray-Darling in all of Australian culture. That's what it could be, and well, that's what it should be. Let's bring some more of that.
Fairness, mateship, opportunity, equality. And I guess that I would then add a certain resilience of character, the ability to see that the odds are against you and still rise to meet your fate.
And with that very admirable and inspirational notion, I think we'll end it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.
Thanks for watching.